Welcome to the Being Formed podcast. My name's Adam. I'm the host, and this is a soul care ministry of LifePoint Resources. We're glad that you're here to listen in. I'm excited to introduce Lori Shoults and Cheri Hudspith to you today. They are both co-directors of Practice Collective, which is a Christ-centered nonprofit ministry providing experiences and communities and resources, all inviting and encouraging followers of Jesus on their inward and their outward journeys of spiritual transformation. Very good friends of mine. I love their hearts. I love their resources. I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. So without further ado, let's dig in. Lori and Cheri, welcome to the Being Formed podcast. It is such a joy and a delight for me to be looking at you and to be entering into this conversation. It's been on our calendar for a while. I love every time I get a chance to be together with both of you. And so I'm just so thrilled that the listeners to our podcast are going to get a chance to meet you, to learn about your ministry, and hopefully engage with your ministry too, with all the things that you have to offer. We're going to dig all into all of that in just a few minutes. But before we do, I want to ask you the question that I have come to love asking those who join us. How are you? And really what I'm getting at is, how is it with your soul? And so I'm looking at you, Lori, first here on my screen. Love to have you just say hi to everybody. And yeah, how would you answer that question? How is it with your soul?
Thanks, Adam. It's really great to be here. So thanks for having us. I would say, well, this is a little bit of a crazy time in the world, right? So we're just day after the election. And I would say right now, I'm really grateful for having come into this season, doing some practices like the prayer of indifference. It has been, I think challenging. For me personally, I think it's hard to hold the tension of how passionate sometimes people are, and like people on both sides of the conversation, not just the election conversation, but other conversations right now, that I think I'm finding really feeling the invitation to hold both and of both of those. And so for me, I love a lot of equilibrium in my life. And so I'm a 7. I identify as a 7 on the Enneagram. So that probably comes as no surprise. I love like when things are good and all is well. And so I think this season has been really challenging to really try to be a good listener, to be open, to be paying attention to what I believe and feel on different topics and things, and to feel a sense of peace in the midst of that. So I would say it's been a season of really holding both and.
And you're coming to us from where? Where are you at?
I am currently, I feel like I should say I'm really from Chicago, the Chicago area, because it's been most of my life in Chicago. But I'm currently living in Austin, Texas with my family, and just a little bit north of the city. So
yeah, thank you for naming the tension of just kind of being in this space where you'd like to remain in that both and space and remain indifferent and continue to be present to people, and to God and to yourself.
And to myself. Yeah,
we're recording this the Wednesday, November 6th, day after we know who won the election. How do you move forward with grace and with peace? So we're going to talk about some of that today. And I appreciate you bringing that up, right? Yeah, thanks, Cheri. Lori. And so also I want to say hi to Lori. I can edit this out, but I don't want to. It's too good.
Well, we go together now. So.
Yes. So Cheri Hudspith, and you are coming to us from where?
The Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Cheri, how are you? How is it with your soul?
Yeah. Well, I can really relate to, everything that we've been talking about so far, with it being the day after the election. I woke up early this morning and wanted to find out, if there were results. And one of the things that I've been feeling throughout the day is real gratitude around the fact that we did find out today, and that we're not, living in the tension of that battle that's happened in the past. I really am so, so grateful for that. And then I found myself really thinking about brothers and sisters on, both sides of this particular election, and just feeling, for everyone. And then I just spent some time like naming my own feelings about it all. And the a really sweet outcome of that is I really felt the Lord's presence in all of that. And I felt a lot of invitation to trust, and a lot of gratitude about the perspective the Lord has really given me about living into his kingdom. Like, that's the main way I see myself and the way I want to live out my life. And so these other things are secondary to that. They're not primary. And also, like, really noticing that's a change for me. Like, there would have been previous times when I would have felt more fearful, or I just felt like I had lots of unanswered questions. And I wasn't feeling like that this morning. So I'm really thankful for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would have to agree with you. I was happy to be, a couple days ago and yesterday, even the day of the election, listening to some various people, various podcasts who are all kind of saying similar things. Like, they spent so much time trying to speak into this moment and offer like godly wisdom. And, it's just, it is hard when you're speaking into this and you're in the public sphere, you get attacked no matter what you say. Right. But there's just been this pervasive sense of like a peace of kind of coming over the various people I've been informed by, who are all saying something similar. Like, there's a sense of at this time we just need to remember we are actually part of God's kingdom. That's the kingdom that lasts. That's the kingdom that is here now. It really is something we can at any moment return home to. So I'm appreciative that you're naming that, Cheri, and that we can name that for those who are listening to us.
Yeah.
Again, no matter when they actually do listen to this recording, and no matter what's going on in their lives or in the world at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
Would you be willing, Cheri, to walk us through some of your story? And I see right behind you on your wall a beautiful phrase, "It is well with my soul." And I know that means a lot to you. Whatever you're willing to share with us, how would you talk about your life journey with God, and really just to the point where you are now?
Yeah. Well, thanks for asking. I mean, it's literally one of my very favorite stories, to tell. I'm 57 years old now. And in my mid 30s, I experienced an extraordinary amount of questions about my faith. And it was the first time I'd ever encountered that. I had been a believer since I was 9 years old, and been very much a part of the body of Christ. And through all of my years leading up to my mid 30s. And so I found myself like super disoriented and confused at that point when all the questions started. And I was in an environment that didn't really know what to do, with those questions. And one thing led to another, and the Lord invited me into seminary. And I really resisted that, because I was like, Lord, I've heard the stories. And a lot of people find being in seminary like really kind of tipping them over the edge into walking away from faith rather than solidifying them in their faith. And so I took some time to really wrestle with God about that. But one thing led to another. We relocated to Southern California all of a sudden for my husband's work. Found myself 15 minutes from a satellite campus for Fuller Theological, which my father-in-law had gone to. And when I started taking classes, I was introduced to spiritual formation and spiritual direction for the first time in my life. Whole new conversation. And it was the thing that my soul, every part of me, was hungry and thirsty for. So I easily just, drank it in at the time. When I finished school, I was the Lord hadn't wanted to share with me the whole time I was in the process of going through my master's program, which I did a really slow roll of that. It was 5 years. And then shortly after finishing that, the Lord, in just a normal morning prayer time, just said to me, I want you to teach people to pray in all the ways you've learned how to pray. Mm. And so we just kind of went from there into a couple of years down the road, feeling led to start into spiritual direction training. And I finished that in 2013. And so that's how I got introduced to this whole part of the Christian life.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for saying yes to the journey. And especially, I love what you said about the invitation that God gave you, like, teach people how to pray the way you've learned how to pray. And I think that's really going to come out as we continue to talk about like what the Practice Collective is doing and offering for people. So much of my awakening, I would say, to life with God, even as a pastor who had been, into my mid 30s, when I found my way to seminary and spiritual formation, I was blown away at how much that idea of prayer was expanded. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
To where like reading scripture was prayer. Mm-hmm. To having any kind of spacious time of listening to God, even with others, without like folding our hands or closing our eyes, right? Like, is prayer. And we're going to talk about the exercises here in a bit. That's prayer. So like, I love that God gave you that invitation, and I can see where that took you, and I love it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, so that's Cheri. How about you, Lori? What's your journey story? How did you get here where you are?
Yeah, mine's not quite as sophisticated as Cheri's. I actually was working with somebody. We had been youth group leaders for about 8 years in our church, and I grew up in the church. My dad was a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor. Actually, my parents were pastors in the church. So I never knew a time where I really wasn't in the church. So I kind of stayed on that path and found myself raising my own family there in that same church denomination, which I still love. But I was in my 40s, and I was helping with a kid that had grown up in our youth group who was finding himself with a really tough time of addiction. And so we were working with this family, and we invited this a counselor in to help with that accountability for that. And he ended up inviting his wife into the mix of the group of us that were working with this family. And she and I were going to be working with the mom, spending time with the mom while the guys were all around this kid. And it was really a beautiful time of, the church coming alongside in a time of real brokenness and growth. And it was beautiful. But this friend of mine who we were going to be meeting with wasn't quite ready for that herself. And so I ended up meeting with this counselor. She was also a spiritual director. She also happened to teach in the area of spiritual formation. I didn't know what any of those things were. And we met for coffee, and this friend who was supposed to be coming didn't show up. And she ended up, after getting to know me a bit in this process, just looked across and said, she said, it seems like you're pretty okay all the time. I'm kind of curious where that strength comes from and where that leaves you with the Lord. And my first thought is that not okay to be okay all the time? This doesn't sound like a problem to me. No one's ever questioned me on this. And I've been, leader in the church, and I felt like, things were going along pretty well. And I already said I was a 7 on the Enneagram, so this is probably not a surprise. But anyway, I ended up not knowing really how to answer that question very well, and realized that it really had gone into my soul. So I ended up just saying, that's a really good question for me. And a couple weeks later, came back and started sharing with her what was coming. And I think I was sharing a part of my story, but about 5 minutes in, she said, how are you feeling while you're sharing this with me? And I thought, again, I was just a little stumped by her question. I wasn't crying or anything, so I just wasn't connected to that. So I said, do I look like I'm feeling something? So it just was the very beginning. You can see where this is going. it was the very beginning of discovering the real disconnect that I had. I knew a lot about God, and I had very little heart connection to God at the time. And I didn't hit a time of any kind of crisis of faith, but all of a sudden I got thrown into, as I started to go back and share what I had just been sharing, the tears just started flowing. So it's like the floodgates opened. I couldn't even tell you what was all coming up for me that day. But I cried for about 3 hours in a restaurant, and it was just, I never had that kind of experience before. But it opened up and began a journey for me of, first of all, discovering how disconnected I was from my own story and my own emotions. But God just led me on this very organic, somewhat with her guidance, but then this person that I was meeting with, but then also I started reading, and it just, one book led to the next. And I've shared this with Cheri before, but those authors became my teachers, in that time period. And so I went from, somebody had recommended Ruth Haley Barton's Sacred Rhythms, which was a really meaningful and beautiful starting point on that journey of formation. And that book led to the next, to the next, to the next. Within about 6 months, I was reading Teresa of Avila and somehow ended up in the Mystics. I mean, it was just a crazy journey. But it was about a year long, and it was hard, and it was a time where I had moments where I felt like I don't think I can do this. I felt like I was falling apart. Didn't have a lot of support in that right away, but as I continued to journey through, God just kept bringing people and just enough to keep on going. So it was about a year-long journey, and at the end of that journey, I discovered the spiritual exercises, and so that I'll share more about that part later. But I'm so grateful for that time. It was very organic, and I just felt like God really, helped me understand a depth of His love for me and some of the blocks that I had in really being able to receive that love fully. So, so grateful. I think of that as really like a second conversion time in my life. So now 14 years later or so, I feel like I've become more of a lifelong learner, journeyer, learning more about God, more about myself as I go. So
you haven't arrived yet?
Have not arrived yet. I keep thinking as I hit times in my journey where I think, haven't I done this work before? Haven't I been here before? Now I feel like what's different is I feel a little less shocked. When I hit those times in the beginning, it just felt shocking. Like, how can this be so? But as I just, I've learned a different kind of posture in receiving that kind of invitation. So,
wow.
Yeah.
So many questions I could ask just to follow up. But what I hear in that and what I love is, well, first of all, God's like almost subversive. Like he's gonna get you. You know what I mean? Like God's got this. I think it's a plan for all of our lives, and I think it's just the varying degrees of like the outer scales that need to come off before we actually get to a point of realizing, we can be real before God, and no surprise that it took somebody actively like showing up for you, and in a surprising way. You didn't expect that to be the avenue, but that person was tending to you, listening, paying attention, and asking you questions that you were willing to sit with. Like the time was just so right. Like I love that story. And I think that's true for most people who would say, some form of almost like, I didn't even know I needed anything different to where like what you were saying, Cheri, of like, I was actually starting to ask questions I didn't know if I was allowed to ask, or, I wasn't really in a system where it felt like it was a safe place to ask. Right. So, and everything in between. So,
Adam, what I was saying, I was sharing with Cheri earlier. I feel like one thing that was so profound for me is I thought, I probably could have gone through my whole life. I don't think my salvation wasn't dependent on this kind of awakening, but and many times I feel like I wish I could kind of go back to sort of the blissful unawareness, of some of these things, because it's the harder way, for sure in some ways. But then once I started to open my eyes to it, I couldn't shut it down anymore. So it just feels like this just spaciousness of, the journey with God that I just didn't even have an imagination for. I didn't even know it was possible. So yeah, a couple questions that just sort of poked at that and made me realize that, oh, maybe things weren't as I thought they were. Just opened me up. And I think that is an invitation for all of us, not unique to me, but God just has different ways of bringing it into our life. Yeah. So
That's right. Yeah. And we do, typically, if we could, we would, like you say, protect ourselves from any of the suffering that, seems like it is one of the major players in our transformation and growth. What do you think about that, Cheri?
Yeah, like it is interesting to think about, look back on that time when I got restless and full of doubt. Like it was a painful time for me. And the questions not being answered and the pain kind of remaining was a part of what kind of kept me in it until I got some help. And I'm grateful that's true. I'm grateful that I didn't have the power to ignore it or deny it, that it got so loud that I needed to find help for it.
Let me ask you a question, Cheri, coming at this from a little bit different angle than how Lori's experience was. What would have been least helpful for you if someone came alongside you in those days of questions? And
yeah, well, I can tell you some least helpful things that happened, not out of like a desire to not be helpful, but just because they just didn't know where I was coming from, didn't understand it. So one of the very first things the Lord really drew me into was asking me to honor the Sabbath. And that culturally was not something that my particular expression of the church that I was in, honored. And so when I talked to a couple leaders about my confusion over that, because it isn't what we do here, they listened, but they also wanted to warn me about going in that direction, about it being an Old Testament thing that I didn't need to live by anymore because we lived in the new covenant. So, what was not helpful is not knowing, they did not know how to be with me in the questions that were coming up and seek the Lord together about them. They felt like they needed to have a response to my question.
Yeah. Do you remember anyone particularly helpful to you on that journey?
Yeah. So the way the Lord provided for me was just a few years before all that started to happen. I had the Lord say to me, I think this is one of the first times I felt like the Lord was like saying something and directing me in the saying it, that he wanted me to find a prayer partner. And what was interesting about that was at the time, I was so frustrated about prayer because the only context for it I had was intercessory prayer. And frankly, it's never been something I'm particularly drawn to or good at. And so I was just like grittingly obeying this process, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And so I was like, Lord, I don't even know what that means. But it was an interesting thing, like to hear from the Lord directly like that. There's something about when he speaks to us that way, that there's an invitation in it that you just I was open, to. So shortly after that, at a women's retreat, I met a new friend, and it was one of those weird moments, like, she doesn't know it yet, but I think that's her. I think this is it. And that turned out to be true. And then fast forward a handful of years later, when I'm being introduced to spiritual direction and what it is, I'm like, oh my gosh, Jody and I have been doing that for one another. We just didn't know it had a name. And so she was one of the people that, she wasn't a leader. She was a friend, a peer. And she was able to just hold space for these questions that I was having and pray with me about them.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, both of your stories involve community They involve this desire to, I think, be rooted in community and healthy community in the church. So none of what I have heard or that you've said would make me or anyone else believe that somehow this call to intimacy with God is a call away from the healthy community that holds us and helps shape us, right? So with that in mind, you've joined forces and you've started an incredible ministry called the Practice Collective. And I want to introduce that ministry to our listeners by just giving you a chance. Either one of you wants to jump in here. How did the Practice Collective form? And what are your hopes for this ministry? Like, what's driving you forward in this work that you're giving your lives to?
Yeah, I can answer that to start off with, Cheri, and then you join in anytime if there's anything you want to share. So it came initially out of years ago when I was at Willow Creek Community Church. I had the opportunity to be a part of a thing called the Practice, which was a contemplative liturgical gathering on Sunday nights where we really practiced the way of Jesus, which was really, really cool. It ran for about 3 years. It was amazing. And it came to a bit of an end, although if you looked it up online, you could find it now as the Practice Church. It's kind of come back and is a thriving, wonderful church right now called the Practice Church. But shout
out to Jason.
Shout out to the Practice Church, Jason Pfeffer.
And all the other folks.
Yeah, all the good work going on there. And so, but at the initial sort of coming to an end, it came to an end at one point at the end of that 3 years time. And there were a group of us that formed together and started dreaming about what might be next. And we started a thing called the Practice Collective. And out of that initially came a thing called the Pastors, Priests, and Guides Retreat. And we did one of those back in, I think, 2018. And then it kind of paused for a bit. And so I still continued running things through the Practice Collective. I went on to start working on a thing called the Ignatian Journey, which I think we'll talk about. So initially, the Practice Collective was really the organization that things were just running through. It wasn't a forward facing organization. But over time, eventually I was able to, after I moved to Texas, I turned it into a nonprofit. And at the same time, Cheri had approached me and we started talking and dreaming a little bit about just a shared vision that we both had, and that was really still fit with Practice Collective. And actually, the mission and vision statement that I had come up with years ago, even right before the practice, when I started to turn it into a nonprofit, I realized the mission, this was from maybe 7 years prior, was still exactly the same, which was really beautiful. And Cheri really, we spent some time discerning together and with a few other people. And so out of that came the idea of Practice Collective was there might be some things that we create, opportunities that we create or resources to help you with your next step spiritually. But then there may be also some other great people and resources and partners that we could refer you to. And so that's really the heart behind Practice Collective. So with both spiritual formation and spiritual direction, that's kind of what the heart of the ministry is. So.
Yeah, a little bit more of like just backstory and like the amazing things that God does over time is that so when I first felt the Lord calling me into teaching people how to pray, I didn't have like any structure in mind for how to go about that, right? That was going to be the beginning of working with the Lord and discovering what that could look like. And literally a month later, I was introduced to a life mapping tool called Listen to My Life. And a couple of years down the road from that, I found myself at a leadership training retreat for those particular maps. And my friend and mentor, Sybil Towner, that all of us know and love dearly, she, with just her eyes beaming like they do, brought Lori and I physically together. And she's like, I am so excited to introduce you to each other. And it's really, as the story has unfolded, it's really felt like this kind of prophetic moment that she was really like leaning into something God was showing her and asking of her to bring us together. And so we just kind of organically followed the Lord into like contacting each other as the Lord prompted, as we had, different interests and things and over the years. And then in 2017 and 2018, I moved up to Wisconsin, 2017, 18. I moved up to Wisconsin. So Lori was still in Chicago, and that put us like in commuting distance for meeting up in the middle. And we were both deeply into the spiritual exercises at that point, and really able to encourage one another, dream together about, what might be possible in the future with other people and guiding other people. And so all of that, unfolded. And then fast forward a couple more years later, and my husband, Dave, we received a diagnosis of stage 4 colon cancer for him in March of 2022. And one of the things that went on for me in the first 6 months of that, it was that we were told that he was terminal, from the very beginning, was just this like deep confusion around the idea that Dave had been financially, I was doing what I was doing because of his career and how the Lord had financially provided for us. And if that was about to go away, did that mean that all this, this formation in my own life that was being shared with others, did that mean that was going to go away too? And so I just went through the whole process of that, all the feelings, all the seeking, all the listening. And that led into what Lori was talking about, as we spent some time discerning together at the end of 2022. Hey, maybe the reason why Lori's felt led to move this from a .com to a .org, so to speak, is because I'm actually needing to be able to raise funds, to be able to be supported in this ongoing work. And as we just entered into the conversation with other people, like it just kept solidifying. Yes, we think this is what the Lord really wants us to do. And I'm just amazed at that really 12, 13 year journey that the Lord took us on to where we're at today.
Right. Yeah. You two are the first people that I'm interviewing on the Being Formed podcast who have your feet firmly planted in the Ignatian exercises. You went through them, you've developed them. We're going to talk about what you've developed. I would just like to hear just some of the hallmarks of the exercises. And I think you've already kind of talked a little bit about how that journey impacted you, but really specifically, what was it about the exercises was so formational for you? And anything else you want to share just about the exercises in general, but about your resource called the Ignatian Journey?
Yeah, I would love to start with that one. So I mentioned to you that I went on this year-long journey. And at the end of that year, I discovered the Ignatian exercises. And what was really amazing for me is that there was no like format for this journey that God led me on. It was just very organic the whole way through. I kept a journal that year. And when I discovered the exercises and I looked at the flow of the exercises, I felt like I had already been here. I've already been on this journey. So I was able to go back to my journal. I wouldn't have had the language of how to mark it out in this way, but God led me on a journey that exactly matched the flow of the exercises. So I'll share with you more from a really personal perspective as opposed to sort of the stages or the steps of it. Originally it was meant to be a 30-day retreat. And so St. Ignatius set this up in 4, I think of it as movements, actually a 5th movement, because it starts with these preparation days. And the preparation days, and just to kind of say our particular version of the exercises is not the 30-day retreat, but instead the 19th annotation, they call it, which is retreat in everyday life. So it spans over 32 weeks, as opposed to going away for 30 days of silence. But in that time, so basically the preparation days is this real foundation in understanding God's love for you. And so in my case, it was really discovering God's love for me in a new way, having a real encounter with Jesus like I had never had before. And then as a result of having this like new understanding of God's love, excuse me, that brought me into a real encounter with myself. So I, for the first time, really discovered, not that I thought I was, perfect by any means, but anything I would have counted prior to this time in my life that I would have counted as sin, I think I would have felt like I was doing pretty well not doing, if that makes sense. So it was very manageable, in some ways. But when I encountered myself in this way, it led me to this just deep, like godly sorrow over my own sin, and not sin of, some of the things I would have counted before, but sin like, self-sufficiency and pride, just something that I had never even really considered before. But it didn't take me to a place, I didn't feel a sense of shame. I just more felt this incredible freedom, this like repentance, this turning towards Jesus and really being able to receive his forgiveness and his love, and just, and then out of that came this just desire to get to know Jesus in a new way. So I found myself in the gospel stories and just going through, and this is the same as what happens with the exercises. It's these preparation days, understanding God's unconditional love, and then moving into this movement of recognizing our limited response to God's perfect love. So spending time in, those sin patterns. And then out of that, this 12-week journey through the life of Christ. Like the gospel for yourself. And this is where I feel like in that 12 weeks, I had just this whole new encounter with, God's, the story of Jesus, really, his birth, his ministry, all that he did while he was here on this earth. So I connected so deeply with his humanity, as opposed to what I think I had leaned more into his divinity prior to that. And so getting to know him in a new way. And then out of that, going through his life, getting into the journey to the cross. And you mentioned suffering, Adam. And this is funny because when I first discovered the depth, I mean, I understood, suffering is a part of the journey. But again, I hit this moment when I was at a conference with Cheri, and I crossed paths with her. I came out of a session where I just had this epiphany, this moment of realizing, I think it's the suffering that makes, helps propel you along these stages of faith. And so I said this to Cheri as we're in passing, and she said, okay, I have a question. Does it always have to be suffering? And I was like, I hope not.
Yeah.
I hope not. But it was just this moment of like, the suffering is really a part of it, So when you start off, you feel like this is just wrong. There should be no suffering. But as I came through this, the journey through the life of Christ and hit this place of recognizing, his suffering and being with him in his suffering, it invited me into a deeper journey of really what it means to share in his suffering. So that next movement out of the weeks of the life of Christ and the exercises is the journey to the cross. And then out of that, the resurrection life. And so just like all good spiritual formation work, it's not an end in and of itself, but it's basically for the sake of the world, right? So all that work, the first movements of the exercises are very inward journey, learning more about God, more about yourself. And then that last movement is really for the sake of the world. It's that outward expression. Now, in light of all this, now how am I to live? And so those are the movements of the exercises. For me, it came through the experience of formation. So our particular version of it is really a blend between, it represents my own journey of, through spiritual formation that really matched the exercises, and then the spiritual exercises themselves. So I thought, I don't know who the St. Ignatius guy was, but I think he went on the same journey I did. It was very, very similar. So that's basically my sort of personal experience with it.
Yeah. So the overlay that went on is that probably about 10 years ago, I was working with some colleagues at a different ministry who'd been very formed by the spiritual exercises and their training program. It had been mentioned by people in the spiritual direction training program that I was in. And so when I finished that, I was just really drawn to it, and had discovered Journey with Jesus that Larry Warner had put together. And so honestly naively and ignoring all the advice that you like do it with a spiritual director, I asked Jody if she would be interested in doing it with me. And we started into it. And like in hindsight, looking back years later, I can see that about halfway through, I had some pretty significant resistance. Because Jody isn't, trained in the exercises or attending to that, I just basically phoned it in for the rest of the time. And so then fast forward a number of years later, it's the fall before we find out that we're going to be moving to Wisconsin. And I just feel this invitation over and over from the Lord that he's wanting more time with me. He's wanting to go deeper. And I am resisting it because life is like very full, all kinds of relationships, ministry and stuff. And I'm resisting the invitation. And I don't really even know why I am. And then our life changes. We end up in Wisconsin, and I'm meeting with my spiritual director the first month we're there. And the first question she asked me is, have you at all been thinking about going through the spiritual exercises? And as soon as she said it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is what the Lord's been trying to draw me towards and into. And I knew immediately that I needed to say yes to that invitation. And so she'd been trained using Tetlow's material. And so we started into that. And this is the time when overlapping with, getting together with Lori on a pretty consistent basis. And she has started to dream about creating the Ignatian Journey and started to work with the Lord on what it could look like and forming it and all that. And then my journey through the exercises that particular time, normally it's a 9-month process, but it took me 15 months to go through it. And what's interesting to me about that now is that when I would get into areas related to sin patterns or my story, there were these long pauses that I would take to go into spiritual formation content that would help me attend to that with the Lord in a deeper way, or a way that's different from how the spiritual exercises do that. So I was going in and out of the exercises and formation content, and then engaging with my spiritual director and with Lori around, oh my gosh, this is what God is doing in my soul through all of this. And like we said, that then was the seeds of like, Lori was wanting somebody to do some pilot groups, and I was interested in doing that. And so, one thing led to another, and then we're shepherding people through the process.
Yeah. So you have your own resources fully created. I actually have all of the books sitting down here, and I would love for you to just explain what people would be looking at and experiencing if they were to have the Ignatian Journey books in front of them.
Yeah, it's so it'd be 32 weeks of content that it actually is based. I was able to get permission from Loyola Press to use Kevin O'Brien's version of the exercises. His book is called The Ignatian Adventure. And that just happened to be the resource out of all of them that I connected to the most. And so I wasn't looking to rewrite the exercises. That's been done many times. And so basically took his content and spread it over the 32 weeks as it's presented in Ignatian Adventure, and then added to it some supplemental content, not that's required, because the exercises is, a full journey in and of itself, a journey through scripture. But it just, I think, like if you were in a good spiritual direction relationship, your spiritual director would probably prompt you to read something, or sometimes maybe listen to something or practice. And I think that the additional content, addresses different spiritual pathways, different things to read and listen to. So each week has this content, almost like a buffet, to go up and discern, what you be drawn to, that might help you turn over the soil of this particular theme that you're spending time in. So that's what it's intended, for. So it's art. There's always a Visio Divina. There's always some, a chapter at least from a book to read, for example. And it just helps with the stirring things up to help you get some handles on that content for the week.
And the
So
content that you added really does key into what Cheri was saying. Like the journey she went on was really
yeah,
combining a lot of this language and information that's out there, and noticing how all of this is tying into the journey
right,
that you went on without even knowing you were going on the
right,
Ignatian journey.
right.
But it's so universal, it's so true, and it
Yeah,
really. I went through Kevin O'Brien's book when I went through the exercises 19th annotation years
yeah,
ago. But the thing about the O'Brien book, I think, is great, but there's no pictures. So
yeah,
like
yeah,
it really,
yeah,
like, it's a great book. But
yeah.
when I came across your material, I
Mm.
was blown away, and I mean that.
Mm.
And
Oh, thank you. Well, I have to get a little shout out to my friend, my sweet friend Jenna Perrine, who helped me with the original design of it. And she just sort of handed it over. And then, I spent a couple years just, a mix of curating the content and then putting it together in a design format. And my good friend, Father Michael Spiro, who consulted with me on the project, he was a Jesuit priest. And
mhm,
he said, if you add any kind of element of something visual, the competition out there is like a, sort of like a one-page handout. So,
yeah,
so,
yeah.
so I think that it could be a good thing. So,
I've
yeah,
seen some of his handouts, right? They're
yeah, yeah,
they're
yeah,
not
yeah,
known for their
yeah.
beauty. So
And
like
that's not
they're
necessarily,
known
it's
for like
good,
the
good content.
richness, right? But
Yes,
yeah,
yeah,
so you add the element of beauty to it, and you don't have to necessarily go outside the resources to find something that will help you, as you said, turn the soil in that subject that for that week. And you can, you can choose to read it or not, but it's right there for you. Which
right.
I think the word curated is a perfect word for what you've done with the exercises. So I just want
Yeah.
to say thank you.
I think one more thing I'll say is I think it's exciting when you get into this journey and you realize, like, for me, my imagination was just like just blowing up when I was going on this journey through the exercise, the imaginative prayer, when I was engaging with scripture in this very imaginative way. And so I think you find yourself, it's not unique to me that people find themselves in a really creative space. And so nature and creativity and art and the poetry, those kinds of things that just start to open up some spaces in you, or in me anyway, that aren't just, the one side of my brain that I was mostly using.
Hmm.
So it just
Hmm.
opened up the experiential piece of it. And really, if I could say one thing about the exercises, it's meant to not be read, but to be an encounter with Jesus.
Hmm.
And so those kinds of elements, I think, help open up your spirit, your imagination, your creativity,
Hmm.
which makes it a much more dynamic experience of Christ. So,
Hmm.
Adam, I just like to add something to what it was like to sit next to Lori and watch this unfold, the curating process of it, because it would just blow me away that she would remember about chapters from books that were like perfectly aligned with the theme. But, she would tell me she would sit down with the book, the theme, the verses, and she would just let the Lord bring images to mind that matched with the theme, chapters that matched, the lectures that she remembered hearing, or the podcast she remembered hearing, or something that they did at the practice. And then, once I remembered too that her training is as a teacher,
mm,
that she was also the Lord was using that natural wisdom and desire for different learning styles to be
Hmm.
met in their journey with Jesus,
Yeah.
was a part of what God was doing in and creating the structure that's been created. And it's just incredible to watch God build something through
mm,
how he's designed somebody in
Mm.
this glory.
thanks, Cheri. I never heard you say it quite like that, but thank you. Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And I also hear in that this was slow,
Hmm.
prayerful, a real act of sacrifice of like the fullness of your time and attention, or like connecting to your own relationship and walk and the journey you just described that you had with Jesus, that you wanted other people to have as well. Which I hope that if people hear me describing it this way, they will have this sense I have of you can trust that this comes from a good place. It comes from a heart of pure desire. Well, in today's culture, with so much what feels like polarity and kind of division and kind of very dualistic ways of kind of looking at the world and almost kind of having this us them, it's like it's all in front of us, it's all right there all the time. I'm wondering how you would feel like the exercises could be a good way for someone to um, engage again with God and God's love, and like kind of come home to God's love. Like for such a time as this, like how would you see the exercises speaking into where we're at culturally? And I would say globally, not just here in the US.
Mm-hmm. Cheri, you want to?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd love to share about that. I would say that the prayer of indifference immediately comes to mind when you're asking that question. And the process of that prayer for me is noticing what it is that's troubling me or stirring me, or I'm really wanting something in kind of a clingy, kind of way. And polarity certainly, causes that, because typically we kind of lean towards one side or the other. We're not hanging out in the middle on those things. And it's pretty easy to identify that I have a hard time loving here. Like where I'm at is keeping me from even knowing how to love, what is love. And so the practice helps you to name your desires and just be really honest with yourself and with the Lord about where you're coming from, what your fears are, what your doubts are, what you're angry about, just those kinds of things that, David in the Psalms does a brilliant job of helping us to understand what a conversation like that, looks like. And then it's settling into more of a listening posture from that place, knowing that I'm really needing to receive the Lord's perspective, the Lord's desire. And then sometimes that's like an easy kind of perspective switch that changes fairly easily. And then other times there's a little bit of wrestling and stuff that goes on with the Lord, and it's more of a process rather than an immediate switch. But eventually I arrive at this place where I'm really content in living into whatever the Lord desires for me to be doing and how he desires for me to be showing up in love for other people. And there's so much freedom that comes from that. And once you kind of really entered into that process over and over again, I'm amazed now at literally how troubled I can be, but how clear I am on, I really need to do this. And where I'm going to land is going to be just such a good place in every depth you can mean the word good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll add to that. I mean, I would say same prayer of indifference is probably one of the most profound practices that, that I've incorporated into my life with God. And I think we talk a lot about the rich young ruler, and all of the things that, he came forward and said, here are all the things I've done, all of these things. And Jesus kind of looks at him. First of all, it says he looks at him and loves him, which I think, again, I just am so struck by, wasn't shaming him. But he says, here's the one thing. And so I think quite often I keep this invitation as me recognizing what are the things that I'm attached to here that are keeping me from being able to be in a place of indifference, to have my hands open, a place of surrender, so I can listen to God and learn to love like he loves, basically. So that prayer of indifference has been really profound. And the practice of detachment, that's been a big part. And then also the examine has been a big part of my practice. Many people may have not even know about the exercises, but they've maybe heard about the prayer of examine. And for me, it's kind of like sitting across from the person who initially asked me, how are you feeling?
Mm.
I feel like this is the question every single time I get back into this time with God, where if, I go through those steps of the examine and reviewing my day and paying attention to what's going on for me and having a chance to talk to God about that. That's a really important practice. And the last thing I want to mention is there's a thing called the presupposition that I'd point you to an article that's one article I found out there called Suppose We All Presupposed. But the idea in this day and age right now is really, it feels so important, to be able to, the premises are to see the good, to seek understanding, to ask clarifying questions, and to ask clarifying questions and correct with love, if that's necessary. But the main part of it, I'm thinking right now in this day and age when we're so divided, this is something that I think is really a helpful practice to pay attention to. So,
Thank you. I'd love to point people to that article. So, how do we move into our communities again? As people of love, just as we're instructed to in First John. And I guess, how do we remain in a posture of receiving love from God?
Yeah, one of the practices of the exercises is when you begin your prayer time, typically in the morning, that one of the very first things you do is spend some time sitting in the gaze of God's love and receiving his love, noticing if it's hard to receive his love and asking the Lord's help to actually be able to take his love in, those kinds of things. And I have had a renewed call in the last couple of months to practice that discipline and have felt the difficulty of that in this season. And yet the Lord has helped me rest into it. It takes me some time, right, to get there, but eventually I get there almost every day. And one of the fruits of that in this particular season has been, I feel like I've had some kind of breakthrough related to feeling full permission, full blessing to live with unconditional love for people around me, and some insight into some of the walls that were there that were keeping me from believing that truly being unconditionally loving is the way to be. And there's mystery to that. I can't explain what all God's been up to in that, but something real has shifted. And I am so grateful, excited to see what the Lord's going to do from here with that. And just feel so blessed that such a simple practice and concept in terms of what you're doing, not necessarily simple to do because we're resistant to it, can be so life-giving and so life-changing.
That is wonderful and a great place to wrap up our conversation. Thank you. I think there's two invitations here, at least around the exercises, and I'll go ahead and name them and then let you speak into them. One would be, if you're listening to this and you're like, I think I want to explore the exercises. How do I do this? Well, I think I personally think people would love the Ignatian Journey, and so I really want people to have that sense of invite, that they can find you guys, track you down on your website, and discover what it would mean to go through that journey. The other invitation would be those who could be guides and companions along the way, and how they might be able to use the materials that you've created to help other people on their journey with Jesus then. So Lori, speak into both of those invitations.
Yeah. So the Ignatian Journey is definitely something people can do independently. But again, like we said, to do that if you can with either in community or with and with a director would be the ideal way. So there's the Ignatianjourney.com is the website where you would find those materials. And then Cheri and I on the Practice Collective website, we're in the process. This is one of our dreams for the future. Is we're in the process of putting together a directory of spiritual directors that can help people go through the exercises that we'd love to point you to at some point. But yeah, as far as I see the Ignatian Journey as a real tool for spiritual directors to take other people through. To first go through yourself. I think that's really the best kind of training for it. But then to walk with someone else through them, I think is a really beautiful path for spiritual growth. So if you're meeting with someone in spiritual direction and they seem like they could be ready for a journey like this, we would love to support. Cheri actually even offers supervision. She's got a couple of directors that are guiding people through, and she's supervising them in that process. And that's been really a beautiful journey so far. So
thank you for all that you're doing, all that you're putting out there in the world. And it was a joy to have this conversation with both of you.
Yeah, always dreaming, Adam. It's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you. So thanks for the invitation.
Yes, Adam. Thank you so much for inviting us in, being our friend. We love that we got the chance to do this together today.
I loved our conversation. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Cheri. Thank you, Practice Collective, for being who you are, people living with open hands and open hearts. If you've listened to this today and you are interested in learning more about the Ignatian Journey, I hope you'll reach out to practicecollective.org. And I hope that you'll also pass this episode along to those people in your life who need to hear it. Okay, until next time, grace and peace, everyone.